For today's classic interview, we're going back to April of 2015. I had an interview with a libertarian named John Tamny, and we couldn't even agree about basic economics. I love these conversations with libertarians where their worldview seems to be informed by a totally farcical understanding of the most basic economic concepts. And I think this is particularly relevant now because with Donald Trump's tax plan, we are seeing the rehashing, the revitalization, the renaissance of debunked supply side, so-called free market economic ideals. And I think it's a nice tie-in with my interview back in April of 2015. So let's get into it. I interviewed John Tamny, and we just couldn't seem to agree really about anything. Let's take a look. I'm joined today by Forbes editor John Tamny, also author of the new book, Popular Economics, What the Rolling Stones, Downton Abbey, and LeBron James Can Teach You About Economics. You wrote this super interesting article about your opposition to Marco Rubio's tax plan. Marco Rubio, of course, Republican candidate in the 2016 Republican primaries. I agreed with so much of what you said, which is interesting because I don't agree with much that's published in town hall typically, but I didn't necessarily agree with some of the reasoning. So let's start at the beginning. What is it about Marco Rubio's tax plan that you don't like?
Well, because it has nothing to do with economic growth. And in my view, I'm a libertarian, but if Republicans aren't about growth, to me, they're about nothing. This is a tax plan that says we are going to subsidize ongoing childbirth so that we can continue to pay for the ongoing growth of government. I don't see the growth there. I just see two guys trying to subsidize bigger and bigger government.
So your problem is that the plan from Marco Rubio is growing government. I mean, if we were to say, here's the overarching disagreement you have, is that it's growing government.
Well, it's that, and then we're also talking about a plan that basically uses the tax code to socially engineer. And these guys, Rubio and Lee, bill themselves as conservatives. I don't see what's conservative about government or using the tax code to socially engineer society.
So talk about that, because this is a part, I'm glad you're mentioning this, because in the article you talk about, I'm guessing what you mean by penalizing the hard work of the successful is that the top tax rate would be reduced slightly, but not enough for you, right?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I don't see why Jeff Bezos, who has created something that allows me to order the world's plenty with a mouse. I don't see why Michael Dell, who has made it possible for me to own a computer for next to nothing that in the 1960s would have cost over $1 million. I don't see why they owe more in taxes than I do, just because they're worth many more billions than I am.
Well, let's explore that though. So question one, you don't have to tell me how much money you make, but if we were to talk about if we're to talk about quintiles, right, dividing into 5 quintiles the people's income, are you aware that the average effective tax rate that people are paying is essentially identical from the 60th percentile on up? Did you know that?
I've heard that argument that in fact that it's roughly, and you're saying in terms of a percentage that people pay of their income to the government.
Exactly. So in spite of the fact that we have a sort of ostensibly progressive tax code where the more you make, the more you pay as a percentage of your income, once you get to the 60th percentile, taking into consideration all taxes that are paid, the average is about 32% from 60 percentile on up.
Well, it's an interesting argument, and I would say what you're telling me is that government's taking way too much of everyone's income. Now, certainly, what we're leaving out of this is, let's face it, it's the top 1% of earners, and I'm not one of them, who foot the bill for the vast majority of government. And I don't think that's a good idea. And I would add, I think it's a terrible idea if we're trying to lift the income and growth possibilities of those not in the 1%.
Okay, so then now that's really getting into the meat of what I want to discuss. In your op-ed, you say, Senators Rubio and Lee have feebly called for a reduction in the top tax rate from 39.6% to 35%. Lest we forget, there are no companies and no jobs without investment first. The rich, by definition, have the most disposable income to invest. as a self-proclaimed libertarian, I would imagine you would realize that business investment is tax deductible, and a higher rate on personal income would actually encourage business investment. And I'll give an example, and of course I'll allow you to either agree or disagree with me. If I'm 1% guy, right? And my top marginal tax rate is 39.6% instead of 35% or 30% or 25%, I would want to invest that in a business because that expenditure is tax deductible and I'm saving 39% instead of the lower 35 or 30 or 25%. A higher top marginal tax rate encourages investment.
I'm not buying this argument simply because, unless, correct me if I'm wrong,
Yeah.
the capital gains rate on investment, if you actually get a return, is 20%. And so, tax deductible or not, I don't, again, what you seem to be encouraging, or is a tax code being used to encourage investment or not? I don't want either. I want the government not having a role or decision in whether money is invested or not. And what I would say is, if we allow the rich to hold on to their wealth, whether they love business or not, odds are it's going to find its way to new businesses.
But that's empirically untrue. That's been widely debunked. If you have any data that suggests that the rich don't have a drastically higher marginal propensity to save than the poor, I would love to see it. There is not one legitimate study that suggests that. And a simple thought experiment, I think. Well, hold on a second. Well, hold on. Let me get the question out, and then you can take it whatever direction you want. The richer you are, the less likely you are to need that additional money. And it's been widely shown that the richer you are, the higher percentage of new income you are to save rather than invest. And lowering the top tax rate only encourages that activity.
Oh, well, thank you very much for saying that, because you just made my point beautifully. You've made the argument that I make to people all the time. So let's say I'm one of those much demonized one percenters and I'm worth billions and I'm Mr. Scrooge. Okay, so maybe I'm kind of conservative with my money, so I'm going to keep it all in the bank or cash equivalent. If I do, are banks paying me interest on my wealth because they want to stare at it lovingly? No, they're lending it out to those who have immediate consumptive needs. They want to buy a car. They want to buy a house. They need tuition money for their kids. Or better yet, maybe they want a loan so that they can start a business. If I am holding on to my wealth, it is by definition being redistributed to people not nearly as wealthy as I am.
There's a couple problems with that argument. Number one is that while you're not wrong that the money that a one percenter saves, socks away, is going to be then turned into loans which banks make, when we look at the economic multiplier of spending $1 here versus $1 there versus $1 there, we know that money sent through the banking system, the way you describe, has one of the smallest economic multipliers. In some cases, in fact, with some hedge fund and equity fund activity, the way you're describing, it has a negative multiplier effect. So while what you're saying is not inaccurate, every serious economic study shows that if a rich person actually spends or invests that money in real business, the stimulative effect is orders of magnitude greater than saying, I'll save it and banks will lend that money. And all you're really doing when you do that is just enriching banks by allowing them to collect interest.
Okay, great. And look, and I'll be the first to tell you, I'm not against banks, but I thought it was a very big mistake that we bailed out the banks. But again, you're making my point for me.
I don't think I am.
I constantly hear about how the rich are really greedy and everything.
I've not said that. Let's focus on what you and I have said.
That's generally what I often hear. Okay, so you're right. Having worked in private wealth, I know this intimately, they generally don't want to keep it in cash or cash equivalents. All I'm saying in bringing up the banks is that if they do that,
yeah,
their wealth is by definition being lent out to others, in many instances not nearly as wealthy as they are. To say otherwise, to say that banks sit on money is to engage in falsehood.
But who has said that? Because my argument doesn't include the assertion that banks sit on money.
I can say that most don't want to do that. In fact, they want to invest in the stock market, in which case we're getting a better multiple. They're investing in more innovative companies. But even more than that, many of them want to invest in venture capital funds.
The problem is that if, even though you may know people that want to do that, there are broad economic analyses that tell us that the marginal propensity to save for a one percenter is so much higher than for someone who is lower on the income brackets, and
Beautiful.
that the stimulative effect of putting that money in the hands of those with a higher marginal propensity to spend is orders of magnitude higher than just socking that money away in stock. So while you're not
Dave,
wrong,
how is it that we're having this conversation? Are we having it on Skype?
yes, it is.
Yeah, well, how was Skype created? Did it just come out of thin air, or is it a result of savings?
Nobody is arguing that
Okay,
all
no,
savings
you're
is
trying
bad.
to
The
tell me
issue
it's
is when
not
we're talking
stimulative,
about
but
tax
it's
policy as a
tax
point.
policy. So you would prefer, you think it's more stimulative for the government to take more of the wealth held by the one percenters, and what would you do with it? Who would redistribute this wealth?
It's not an issue of redistributing the wealth. It's an issue of, hold on a second, hold on. You're making a bunch of different disjointed arguments, all based on faulty
I'm not.
supply
I
side
want to know
nonsense.
why you think what you think.
What I think is based on the facts. And the fact is, hold
facts
on a
you
second.
bring
Whoa,
up
but hold on.
studies that
You
you
asked me a
have no
question
backing for.
you asked me a question and you're not letting me answer.
Okay, fine.
Your argument is that to stimulate investment, this is in black and white. It's in the town hall article, that to stimulate investment, the top tax rate should drop not from 39.6% to 35%, as Senator Rubio has suggested, but it should drop much more to stimulate investment. That's what you said in the article.
Absolutely.
Can we at least agree on that?
Absolutely, I said that.
Okay. What I'm saying is that it has been demonstrated beyond reproach that to create an incentive for investment, there needs to be, if I can not pay 39% by investing my money, or I can not pay 30% by investing my money, not paying 39% is a much more compelling reason to invest than not paying 30%. I mean, how could you deny that? It's just simple math.
How can I deny it? You keep bringing up demonstrated beyond reproach in studies that, of course, you can't produce, and I can't have access to them right now.
But let's forget. Let's just talk as two reasonable people. Hold on. Let me reframe it. You're making a fair point.
You can't get beyond. There are no companies and no jobs without investment first. I would rather leave the wealth created in society in the private sector.
Let's just do a simple thing. Hold on a second, John. Let's refocus. Let me just ask you a question. You have $100, right? I say to you, listen, if you keep that $100 at the end of the year, I'm going to take 40% of it, okay? Or I say, if you keep that $100 at the end of the year, I'm going to take 5% of it. The way to avoid me taking either amount is by investing the money in a business. Are you going to be more likely to invest to avoid losing the $40 or the $5?
It's entirely possible that I would be more likely not to invest, because I don't know about you, but I've worked a lot in the investment industry. Most investments fail.
Oh,
And so
John.
the idea that an investment is a one-way street is kind of fanciful. It's not a world that I'm familiar with.
But then you're making a different argument now. Now you're saying actually the government shouldn't incentivize investment because it's risky.
What does the government do right now? If I buy a New York City or a California municipal bond to fund government spending, I don't pay any tax on the income at all, federal or city. But if I have the temerity to take my wealth and invest in a future Google or Microsoft, well, if I get income on that investment, I'm going to pay a tax on that.
But it's a far smaller tax bill than paying it as income, right? You admit that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think that's unfortunate. I
Okay.
do not like the idea that government taxes income at such a high rate. In my perfect world, they would tax capital gains at zero. I don't see why we would tax those who are providing capital to the businesses and jobs of the future. It is a mystery to me.
All right. Well, that is certainly a different conversation, which we can have. We've been speaking with John Tamny. The book, of course, is Popular Economics, What the Rolling Stones, Downton Abbey, and LeBron James Can Teach You About Economics, released today. I hope there's some demand side economics in that book. Otherwise, it's going to be a tough one to get through, John. But I appreciate you being on, and even though we didn't agree on much, it's an interesting conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.